Penny says, fly, cake, fly. Where Penny says, that'll keep the sneaky squirrel away. In the just like on Penny says, that'll keep the sneaky squirrel away. Where Penny says, oh no, the sneaky squirrel can fly too. Where Penny says, after her. Where Penny says, she's going to clouds. Where Penny says, I got the cake. In the just like the Penny says, I got the cake. The Penny says, oops. Where Penny says, well, doers. Where Penny says, he just won't stop till he gets that cake. Where Penny says, what else can stop her? Where Penny says, how about she can catch something? Where Penny says, how about this boomerang? Where Penny says, wait, does boomerang start with the letter B in the... Just like the Penny says, wait, does boomerang start with the letter B? Where Penny says, yeah, it does. Zoe taught me that. Where Penny says, it says here in the letter B. Where Penny says, abracadabra, sneak squirrel, go catch. Where Penny says, it worked. We got the cake. We did it. I got the cake. Where Penny says, let's go to the Doozer Creek. Where Penny says, Zoe, Daisy, we're back. Where Daisy says, Penny, thank you. You got my birthday cake. Where Penny says, aw, Daisy, Will, you're embarrassing me. Where Penny says, well, should we celebrate? They say, hooray! That sneaky squirrel says, hooray! And then Zoe says, wow, sneaky squirrel, you're really gonna fetch. Then Zoe says, she's back! Where Zoe says, don't worry, let's see if she can get past the mighty Zoe. Where Zoe says, ha! Miss me! Then Zoe says, ha! Miss me again! Where Zoe says, sorry, I got mighty speed. Where Zoe says, ha! Miss me! Where Zoe says, ha! Miss me again! Where Zoe says, that's one sneaky creature. Where Daisy says, well, the sneaky squirrel's gonna get my birthday cake. Where Penny says, don't worry, Daisy, we can hide your cake. Where Penny says, how about a wall or a fort? Where Penny says, wait, Zoe, which one starts with the sound, wall or fort? Then Zoe says, fort. And then Penny says, Zoe, you're right, fort. Where Penny says, it says near the letter F. Where Penny says, 3, 2, 1, a fort. Where Sneaky Squirrel says, cake, go bye-bye. This Sneaky Squirrel says, wait. Where Penny says, welcome to Fort Wheel. Then Zoe says, Penny Lane, darling, this is perfect. There's no way this Sneaky Squirrel could get in here. Where Daisy says, wow, thank you, Penny. This will be perfect. Where Penny says, now you may have a seat. Where Daisy says, wow, thank you, Penny. Where Daisy says, huh? Then Daisy says, the Sneaky Squirrel says, 2 cakes. Yeah, they said, the Penny says, not even a cake fork can stop her. She's so determined. Where Daisy says, well, party's over. Once the Sneaky Squirrel steals my cake and she goes back to her foxhole, then she eats it. Where Penny says, don't worry, Daisy, we'll get her cake back. Where Daisy says, come on, doozers, let's glide. Ready? Where Penny says, 3, 2, 1, blast off. Where Penny says, Zoe, do not let Daisy eat the tomato. Where Zoe says, oh no you don't. Step away from the tomato. Where Penny says, there she is. Where Penny says, she's heading for her foxhole. Where Penny says, that's where she eats the cake. Where Penny says, we had to catch her. Where Penny says, oh no you don't. Where Penny says, wait, this way, that way, this way, that way. Where Penny says, we can't catch up to her. She's too fast. Where Penny says, I know, how about we get dash or fast? Where Penny says, wait, which one starts with the sound where Penny says, fast or dash? Where Penny says, fast. Where Penny says, it says here in the letter F. Where Penny says, 3, 2, 1, fast. Where Penny says, whoa. Where Penny says, yahoo. Where Penny says, woohoo. Where Penny says, hey sneaky squirrel. This sneaky squirrel says, where Penny says, whoa. Where Penny says, it's hard to stop when you're flying fast. Where Penny says, wait, stop. Where Penny says, there's a foxhole. Where Penny says, wait, this way, that way, this way, left, right. Where Penny says, where'd you go? Where Penny says, ah, this way, that way, left, right, this way, that way. Where Penny says, whoa, Doozers, look at all the cakes she's eaten. This like so, whoa. Where Penny says, hey, sneaky squirrel. Where Penny says, sorry, sneaky squirrel, can we have Daisy's birthday cake? Where the sneaky squirrel says, oh, fiddlesticks. Where Penny says, thank you, sneaky squirrel. Where Penny says, wait, Doozers, I think she wants to tell us something. Where Penny says, what's wrong, sneaky squirrel? Where Penny says, are you sad because you didn't mean to? Where sneaky squirrel says, yes. Where Penny says, so you were alone? The sneaky squirrel says, yes. Where Penny Link says, do you have a band? The sneaky squirrel says, sneaky squirrel does not have a band. Where Penny says, oh, that's so sad, you don't have a band. Where Penny says, well, we have a band. Where sneaky squirrel says, yes. Where Penny Link says, what's wrong? Where sneaky squirrel says, I love cake. Where Penny says, oh, now I see you want Daisy's birthday cake. Where Penny Link says, because it was your birthday too. Where sneaky squirrel says, yeah. Where Penny says, well, don't worry. Where Penny says, hey, would you like to come with us at Daisy's birthday party? The sneaky squirrel says, yes, I will want to, I want to. Where Penny says, great. Where Penny says, now let's go home. Where Daisy says, what do you call a snail on a boat? Then Daisy says, a snailer. Where Zoe says, Daisy, that was a good one. Where Daisy says, yeah, I know. Where Daisy says, Penny, you're back my birthday cake. And then Daisy says, ah, sneaky squirrel. And then Penny says, don't worry, she just wants to say sorry. Where Penny says, go ahead, sneaky squirrel. This sneaky squirrel says, sorry, Daisy. Where Penny says, it's Daisy Wheel. The sneaky squirrel says, sorry, Daisy Wheel, I didn't mean to take your birthday cake. Where Daisy says, oh, that's okay, sneaky squirrel, I forgive you, and I accept your apologize. Where Zoe says, well, since we're all together again. Where Penny says, yeah, Zoe, how about we can celebrate? Where Penny Link Zoe says, let's celebrate. Where Penny says, wow, Zoe, I'm so happy we got Daisy's birthday cake back. And of course, Sneak Squirrel too. Where Penny says, well, what do we like to do?